morning, everybody. I hope that you've all managed to arrive at least a little bit dry, that it's not too rough out there. I want to acknowledge that we are meeting today on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present, and recognise that Gadigal women in particular have been telling stories and sharing ideas on these lands for tens of thousands of years. So today we join in what is a really important tradition. Welcome to Raising Boys. My name is Jamila Rizvi and I'm joined this morning by Jess Hill, Walkley Award-winning investigative journalist. Thank you. Author, educator and one of Australia's most recognised and respected thinkers on gendered violence, and Dr. Zac Seidler, clinical psychologist, global director of research at Movember and associate professor at the University of Melbourne. Now, before I bring Jess and Zac into the conversation proper, I want to say something very briefly about the conversation we're about to have. Caring about boys is a feminist issue. Sometimes when we talk about how boys might be struggling, I think there's an anxiety, particularly among women, that we're somehow taking our eye off the ball, that we're letting men off the hook by making them the focus. I don't think that is what today is about. The harms being done to boys in our culture will only exacerbate the harms that are done to women by men in the future. Talking about how we support boys is essential and important for those boys, and it's also essential and important for the girls who will be their peers. I also want to say that when we talk about boys and men this morning, we are painting in broad strokes, necessarily. There are going to have to be some generalisations because at the core of those generalisations are some truth. But of course, everything is messier, more complex and more varied than generalisations. So let's get on with it. Jess, new data came out this week that found that a quarter of Gen Z men agree that a wife should obey her husband. That's twice as many compared with baby boomer men. Now, this was a global study, but Australia was included. What's going on with the young men?
Well, can I say maybe also baby boomer men have learnt from experience that wives aren't going to obey their husbands, and maybe life has radicalised them, as Gloria Steinem has said. I think it's interesting, that survey, it showed not only were Gen Z boys more likely to think that, but then another big proportion of Gen Z boys are the most progressive compared to other age groups. So I think what we're seeing is polarization. That should be like the word of 2025, 2026 and 2027, where you're having, where boys are becoming a site of contestation, right? Politically, commercially, in a way that perhaps they haven't been so much before. Girls and women are used to being a site of contestation. They're used to being exploited commercially and politically, and we've developed a politics to respond to that, which is called feminism. Boys and men, this is a relatively new experience, being exploited commercially, being targeted by political interests, by people who would seek to exploit their insecurities. They don't have a politics to respond to this. I think that the Gen Z boys have grown up during a time of massive social experiment, which is that since about 2008, 2010, you've had social media platforms, otherwise known as behaviour modification machines. You've had free online porn. And then as of about 2018, 2019, you've had algorithmic recommender machines, just absolutely mainstream misogyny, right? And I know we'll get to the so-called manosphere a bit later, but I think that what used to be something that you might go out and seek content from those more extremist thinkers, in the last 5 or 6 years, that extremist content has come and found young men in a way that is unprecedented historically. So I think that what we're seeing from these Gen Z boys and men is a lot of confusion, perhaps reaching for some simple answers when life feels complicated. But I also don't think it's not time to panic, the people of Springfield. But it is time to be aware of why things are going the way they are and what we as people and as parents, as citizens need to do to resist that and to protect our Gen Z boys, our Gen Z girls and people more broadly.
Zac, I know you're not a fan of the term toxic masculinity, nor am I, but I also know that for a lot of people, that phrase feels like it describes something very real. And so, in your view, what's happening to our boys, and what's a better way for us to talk about it?
So I think that, as Jess was talking about, there is this overarching experience right now of grievance, of loss, of confusion, and most importantly, it is an identity collapse in many ways for lots of young guys. Now, young women are going through lots of struggles equally. It just so happens that it's a very internalized experience. There's this anxiety, there's this shame, there's this guilt that happens for lots of young women that I have seen clinically. They don't take things out on the world. It's not seen and heard in the same way that it is for young boys. And so what I'm really seeing and hearing amongst young guys is this loss of purpose, is this misunderstanding of their value, and they're seeing the likes of these feminist scholars and people on Instagram saying that there is something wrong with them, that there is something innately broken within them, and they go, what the hell am I supposed to do with that? I go to Westfield and I get called out, by young women saying, I'm toxic. I didn't do anything. They don't know who I am. In the same vein that lots of women are catcalled, and lots of these guys go, where do I belong now? And what they do is they go online and they are offered certainty. They are offered this notion of snake oil, really, which says, do this, be this, listen to this, buy this, and you will be ripped and rich, which is really the notion of what masculine status is for a 14-year-old boy. Andrew Tate is a 14-year-old boy. That's what he is reflecting, honestly. A bald one, and very early. And I think that what we're missing here is that a lot of young guys, when we talk to them, and we do this at Movember, I do it in my clinical work, when we talk to them and we say, what do you think and feel about this content? They go, I leave the bullshit at the door. I'm watching this stuff and I'm like, oh, that's yuck. I don't want to see that. But the algorithm continuously feeds it to them because it's transgressive and it's entertaining. And they are 14 and 15 and they're looking to break shit. And that's what the algorithm is offering them. And so they go, all right, well, this must be a mirror of what society wants me to be. I need to act this way. I need to be an alpha. I need to look smacks and, punch myself in the jaw in order to get perfect features. And it's radical, it's extreme, and it's not real. And then they come in to see me, and I say, do you actually want to do these things? Do you value them? And they go, no, my mum thinks I'm sweet and caring, but I go into the schoolyard, and if I show that, I get beaten up, I get bullied. And the greatest fear for young men is ostracism. And so they seek community. And the greatest way to seek community is to be part of a gang, is to be part of a movement online, is to comment on things and become an incel, and suddenly you've got people around you, when all the good guys, they don't have anywhere to go. We need to create these third spaces for all of them to have their views promoted in a way that the really shit ones are.
Which is where we get to the algorithm and the fact that the algorithm doesn't want to promote the good guys and the kind of male role models who might be providing more complex answers that are less instantaneously satisfying than get ripped, get rich, neg her so that she'll be so confused that she'll end up saying yes to a date with you. If you have algorithms that are preferencing the most outrage, and they're doing, the interesting thing is it's doing the same for women. The algorithm does the same thing. It's not, it's amoral in a way, this algorithm. It's just like, we are going to modify your behavior for clicks. We need to keep you hanging around, and the easiest way to do that is to keep you outraged and agitated. So for women, you're starting to see these content funnels that are much more sort of aggrieved versions of feminism. So a lot of narrative about how unsafe we are, the sorts of red flags you need to look out for, coercive control, which is my wheelhouse. Thank you for communicating that, algorithm. But sometimes when it might be almost all of what you're seeing about men, it creates a very scary, a sense of being afraid of men. And then you've got on the other side the manosphere influencers who are creating a sense of being intimidated by women to the point where you can't treat them like people anymore. You have to undermine them and manipulate them to get around them because they're so tricksy, you know. And so there's just gender divergence and isolation from one another and a sense that we don't understand each other anymore. When in fact, actually, if you take out all the algorithmic stuff, we do still understand each other. It's just there's a lot of noise.
I think that the real concern that I see amongst young guys is that if they are, 12 to 16, they don't really do well in the grey. And the way in which we're talking about manhood, positive masculinity, toxic masculinity, it's all very black and white. And we need them to sit in the grey, which is that they have a diverse experience, they have all of these different parts of themselves, which are often neutered and atrophy over time. What we really want is for them to have this expansive understanding of what they can be. And what these algorithms kind of do is they don't promote me, I'd have way more followers, of this idea of like, let's just sit in the mess as fathers, as teachers, as brothers, let's all just muck around together and try and understand who we want to be and co-create it. That's not really a good message for a 13-year-old boy who's being bullied, who gets steroid ads instead. Much easier fix for him, even though it comes with a needle for some reason. So that's what I don't really understand, is that we need to move into this space where young boys are willing and able to sit amongst their peers and discuss the fact that they have no idea what the fuck is happening.
Zac, can you walk me through through a journey? You're a 14-year-old boy. You were once, cute toddler who can't pronounce the word banana. Then you're this smiley 9-year-old who's, got lots of facts about black holes. Then you start watching more on YouTube. You get a phone. You start high school. You find your way onto TikTok. And 2, 3, 4 years later, that kid's 16. He's in a completely different ideological place. What are the key points? What's happening along that pathway?
This is really personal for me. I'm trying to work out if the cries on my 8-week-old son in the audience. I'm here. He can hear my voice. He's like, stop talking about me. But understanding this trajectory, it's been very theoretical for me. It's been very clinical, and now it's becoming very personal. And I'm reflecting on my own experience and what I went through over those years, and really what went wrong and what I would do differently. And what I would describe really is that, and this is going to be very sad for lots of the parents, I'm hoping that there are quite a few men in the audience. That was why I'm here, to bring the guys in, so hopefully there's a couple of them, not just the mums who lead this revolution. It's so important to understand that modern day masculinity is a process of grief and loss, which is to say that there's this incredible study done by Judy Chu, who's a contemporary of mine, and she talks about how she went and she did this ethnographic study where she followed a 4-, 5-, and 6-year-old group of boys and went to preschool and started to see what was going on. And at 4, they have this beautiful spectrum of emotions. This connection, this desire to be a part of something. There's not this hierarchy, there's not this competition, but slowly and surely, they start to cut off parts of themselves. And I'm sure that any man in the room can think about those, experiences that they had, where you get up on stage and you sing something, or you put up your hand and you say something, and it's gay, or it's effeminate, or it's whatever it might be, and you say to yourself in the back of your head, I can never do that again. And it goes, and it leaves you, and that happens as early as 4 or 5, to the point where boys go, all right, being a man means not being a woman. It means not being this. And that's my problem with the way in which we're considering manhood. It's a process of loss rather than addition. It's not an understanding of what I can gain, how I can grow. It's the idea of what not to be. And so we need to get to the point where we can talk to our young boys around, what do you want to be? Girl power, the Spice Girls, an incredible movement. Every book you see for young girls is like, be an astronaut, be the president. And we have lots of reason for that type of content, gender pay gaps, etc. But we're now at a point where we are not talking to our young men about what to aspire towards. And so they're continuing on this process of loss, where they end up with this really deep-seated anger, because they cannot show joy, they cannot show sadness, because they will be vilified for it. And as a result, you end up with them taking things out on the world and picking and choosing really simple answers to deal with the distress that they're sitting with.
It's, I remember reading Bell Hooks early on when I was getting into the gender-based violence work, and she writes that the first act of violence men perpetrate is against themselves. And what Zac's talking about there really reminds me, there's this poem, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but it goes along the lines of, many times have I seen a man weep and beat his heart until it was unconscious. And there's a sense that as boys and young men age, that the safe place is to be numb. And my partner David, who's here in the room somewhere, is a psychotherapist, and something that we've spoken about often is some of his male clients will come in and just so unable to even name an emotion aside from just like the primary colours, and that sometimes he's literally used aids like a chart that you would use for people with autism to say, like, here is the range of emotions that you now need to sort of intellectually learn at an older age to try to expand your sense of feeling. And I think that sense of where you have to carve off half of yourself to be acceptable, I mean, that's part of what a lot of teenagers are starting to reject, especially gender non-binary stuff. I mean, we're talking in very binary terms. A lot of teenagers don't talk in these sorts of binary terms. We're very old. But there's a sense of sacrifice that occurs in order to fit that box. And I guess that's one of the saddest things about what this whole algorithmic experiment on young people has done, and what the manosphere does. It shuts down the very avenue that might actually have some answers to this, which is actually feminism. It doesn't always deliver the answers to boys in the way that is helpful, but the manosphere shuts down that way of thinking about how feminism is for men is for everybody by saying feminists are trying to undermine you. They're going against nature, and there's this whole rise again of this biological determinism. Men are supposed to be this. Men are from Mars, and women are from Venus, and men do this, and women do this. It's just it's so regressive, and it's going exactly in the opposite direction of what the natural arc of this conversation should be going. The only last thing I'll say before we move on to the next part, it's something I was thinking about last night. We've had many times of backlash since second wave feminism started in the 70s. Many times we've thought, men are in crisis, boys are in crisis, what do we do? Now in the 80s and 90s we had like the mythopoetic men's movement, and it was like, okay men, we need to go into the forest and we need to sit around some campfires and we need to find
Let's bring that back.
The warrior. That's not the point I was going to make, Zac. And it was like, wow, they're rites of passage. And of course, we're still talking about where are the rites of passage for teenage boys and whatever, but that was really the frame. And now we're actually talking about how can we nurture boys to be in touch with their emotions, do the hard stuff, and be strong, be both, not choose one or the other. But it's a really honest conversation we're having now. It's just in an incredibly heightened environment.
And there are no simple solutions. Just for the mothers out there who are potentially losing hope, what's very important to realise, and I know that you all see this, is that there is innate beauty, complexity, emotionality within boys and your husbands and your fathers that they have within them that they have just lost access to. It's not a fact by any means, no matter who tells you, that they don't have it as a part of their base product. We were all born with those default options, and it takes a bit of time, but they need safety. They need safety in order to show it, and it shouldn't happen when shit hits the fan. It should happen in those little moments each and every day.
We've started to talk a little bit about the algorithms, and I want to stay there for a moment longer. I promise, folks, we're coming to the sort of the solutions type piece, the hopeful part, but I feel like we've got to get deeper into the problem first. And I want to ask about the monetization factor, because both of you have at different points mentioned something that is akin to a business model, right? Because in the end, no one is posting a whole bunch of content online for boys without a purpose, right? There's a purpose that's involved here. And Zac, we might start with you. There is I think, an idea here that we are creating an unattainable standard of masculinity online. This sort of super tough, super buff, super rich kind of dude. I mean, as soon as I say that, I feel, as a child of the noughties, like I start thinking about the business model that was given to girls and that is still given to girls and women, right? And the way that our insecurities were profited off. How are boys' insecurities being turned into a business model?
Yeah, it's very strange that like the American psycho ideology of like being a suit is now cool. I find that very strange. It's like they were the biggest nerds ever, and now it's like we all want to do that. What is happening is that there is this inability to access a clear path for many of them. And so what the algorithm does is these guys come in and they say, you've got a 12-year-old boy, okay, who comes in with really very fair objectives, which is, I want to know how to talk to girls. I want to potentially make some money. That sounds kind of fun. I want independence and freedom. And I want to get, a bit bigger, potentially. It's not fun being a prepubescent boy. And they come in with these ideas, and what happens is very quickly, this is the notion of mainstreaming of the manosphere. They come in with these ideas, which we should be trying to help them solve, because they're fair. And what it does is it very quickly moves them into these extreme solutions, all of which are products. And so you're going to see, whether it's SMH, the Australian, doesn't matter what it is, you're going to see articles about peptides very soon, because it's been on our radar for a very long time. You've got 14-year-old boys having mini fridges with injectables. And it is this idea of trying to be someone other than myself, because it's so uncomfortable to sit with myself and be unable to fix this idea that I am in some way deficient. Really. And so the greatest way to succeed is to be dominant, is to just not take any prisoners, is to go my own way. And the saddest part of this, if you look at any of these influencers, they are solitary monks. They're in the gym, they've got these videos of themselves in the gym, and there's no one else fucking there. They're on their own. They're so isolated. And so what I try to do when I'm talking to young guys is being like, these guys don't have what you think they have. They are actually trying to distance you from the very people, your mates, who can bullshit check you. So instead, they pull you apart, they make you extremely insecure, they sell you the product that actually makes you feel worse about yourself, and you don't have anyone to sense check it with, because you're not going to talk about it with your mum, because you're going to end up in this criticism, anger cycle that really doesn't serve you in any way, because the core thing is that they don't feel seen and they don't have anywhere to go. And if someone is saying taking testosterone implants is going to be the safest way for you to get to your goal, without passing go, that's really what they want. They want the quickest, easiest solution, and girls have been doing it for a very long time as well, to their own detriment. So we need to get in the trenches and understand what these guys are selling, which is, as I said, it's certainty. They are also selling this idea of 12 rules for life, simplicity. They are offering a very clear pathway for young men to navigate an extremely uncertain world.
Yeah. Jess, they're not just selling a product, though. They're also selling a political ideology to an extent as well, aren't they? I think we talk about the manosphere as if it's like a destination. Like, we went to the manosphere today,
right.
When actually it's just the whole internet now.
Yes, the weather was fine.
Can you help us understand what? I know, like, we don't have time in this session to get into the deep complexity of it, but we know that there are sort of some broad ideologies that exist within this group. What are the kind of ideologies that young men are at risk of falling into?
Well, I guess the overarching ideology is red pill ideology, if we were going to just simplify it, which is, it's kind of hilarious that it was taken from The Matrix, which was written by two trans women, and taking the red pill was actually about realizing that you were trans, which I don't think the manosphere is full cognizance of. Anyway.
They have to take another pill.
They take another pill, the purple pill? I don't know. Anyway, so the idea is that if you take the blue pill, like in The Matrix, you remain oblivious and you just trundle along in your happy little naive lives. And if you take the red pill, then you're going to wake up to how ugly society really is. Yay, what a great product. So we're going to sell the red pill to you and say, like, if you're hard, if you're made for this world, then you're ready to see it for what it really is. And what this world really is that you are up against women who are now economic competitors with you. Not only that, but they are hypergamous, which means that they want men who are of higher status than themselves. 80% of them want only 20% of the men. So in order to be in that 20%, you're going to need to lift, inject peptides. You're going to need to probably do something illegal to make money really quickly, whatever. But it's not just that. It's also, it's so horrible because what I think is really, there's so many little kernels of truth in this, in that a lot of boys, young men can feel like, my struggles don't get recognised anywhere. Like, I hear a lot about girls' struggles being recognised in places, but my struggles and my depression or my sense of insecurity doesn't seem to be recognised in, mainstream discourse. So, these influencers, man-influencers, will recognise that, but they'll say, pleasure is for pussies. Pleasure is for women and children, because they don't have important lives like you do. What you have is grind.
Suffer.
And what you need is to suffer, and suffering is success. So it's like, oh, good. Well, then I must already be quite successful because I'm feeling quite shit about myself. And Louis Theroux made a really good point the other day. He's got a series on the manosphere. It's about to come out on Netflix in a couple of days, actually. And he said, I think a lot of these guys actually come from really hard backgrounds, and they're trying to, much like Anthony Robbins, if anyone's been to one of his seminars, is trying to translate that personal pain into some kind of success, and then they're selling it to everybody else. It's like, mates, what you need to do is sit down with a therapist and go back to that little boy inside and say, are you okay? Do I need to reparent you? Not like, let's go get ripped and get yachts, which obviously is not going to work for a large percentage of people. So that's the ideology, and it's of course got lots of crossover with white supremacy, with alt-right movements. Interestingly, in Australia, we haven't seen Gen Z men veer across more like conservative or radical right wing, as we've seen in other countries. However, and I don't say that this is inevitable, but we don't just have like a time delay here in Australia. We have like a years-long time delay, I think. And like, I don't know if anyone remembers, for me, I was like, the Kardashians, they arrived here like several years late. Everyone else was into them and we were like, Kardashian who? And then it was like, oh my God, Kardashians everywhere and everyone's got their butts. So like, sometimes we get smug and we're like, that's not going to happen here. And then it does. I mean, we're seeing rise of one nation among Gen X men. But yes, so I think it's not to say that that's not going to cross over into a politics. It hasn't yet. And that's why I think conversations like this, like, we have the benefit of a time delay. Like, let's not let those Gen Z guys get pulled across into stupid ideologies that don't serve them politically.
I'm really worried about, there's the red pill and then there's also the black pill, which is this notion of nihilism, which is what I witness a lot clinically, and I'm sure you've got a lot of grunting teenagers as well who don't seem to think or feel a lot. They do, they have it internally, but they don't think that there is a place for it. They don't think that there is a benefit to exploring or expressing it. And so that idea, that's where we end up with male suicide, epidemics that we're witnessing, because if you are unable to see a world that is going to in any way, encapsulate your view. Otherwise, you're going to get pulled into some of these other, really dark circles where they kind of egg each other on in more extreme suffering in some ways. Again, that is not a default mode for lots of these guys, and I wouldn't wait for the rabbit hole to suck them through. I would be always looking for this stuff and not freaking out when you start to see some of these behaviors coming up. It is about that openness and curiosity that is so important to connect with and engage. And let's be very clear, this is happening for middle-aged men just as much as it is young men. The One Nation pull is happening amongst, those boomers and Gen Xers. There is this idea, and we hear it in America, the left vilifies men as they see it, and the right promises them the world and delivers nothing. And, consistently, Trump was talking about all of these ideas of how we're going to give men jobs back, etc., this financial certainty that they were requiring, and there has not been one policy that has been helping them in any way. And so it is such an easy leap, really, to actually cater to this audience, to make them feel seen and heard in a progressive way that doesn't reify these ideas that they have to be like this and women have to be like this.
And I think, I know, just while we're in the framing section before we get to solutions, because I know Jan's going to get us there, and I can't let it go without just making this point. Obviously, I'm here to also represent the women and girls who are harmed when, this all goes wrong. And I think one of the sorts of data that is very much animating government at the moment is the rise in sexual violence among peers in the 16 to 24 age group. So we basically saw with the Australian Child Maltreatment Study a couple of years ago that sexual violence between current or former intimate partners under the age of 18, the rate of that had doubled within a single generation. Now, the most likely sexual abuser of an under 18-year-old is another under 18-year-old, whereas it used to be that would occur from an adult. Again, we come back to the influence of porn, but also this gendered division, objectification. I mean, as they get older, you get dating apps industrializing rejection, where it used to be one rejection at a school dance, now it's 50 rejections in one night. And I think what we're seeing around, as I said, this social experiment that's been run on this generation, hideously, where it's just been a free-for-all. And, for ages, didn't you hear parents saying things like, gosh, we used to just we would go out and we'd be running around the streets until the street lights came on, and then you'd hear mum calling us back in for dinner, and now we're all helicopters. It's like, no, now the kids just go into their rooms and they go off into the alleyways of the world, and that's where they are until mum calls for dinner.
Far more dangerous.
Far more dangerous, and meeting people and hearing things that you never would have heard when you were off on your BMX bike, unless you lived in Palm Beach and there were some really creepy people around. But anyway, not at scale. So I think, if we are, and I don't want to, I'm not the moderator, I know we might not be segueing into solutions, but I do want to just flag the fact that we're trying to re-establish the door on the stable, if I can torture that metaphor. The horses have bolted. The government is actually doing something to try to say, we need to get back in front of this so that the next generation does not go to the charnel house. And one of those things is that tomorrow, age restrictions come in for online pornography. And now, it may surprise some of you, because actually, I have very close people in my life who followed my work for years but did not know that kids could just dial up porn and have the full smorgasbord available to them from any age as soon as they learnt to use a computer or a phone. Now, basically, Pornhub, in advance of these restrictions coming in, as they've done in other jurisdictions, they've made a business decision, which is to say that actually at the moment it's too hard for them to do, age restriction, and they're just cutting off content. So you go to Pornhub, as I was saying to these guys, I go to Pornhub quite often, and I'm saucy, I'm kinky, and yesterday, you go there and basically it looks like the Jeffrey Epstein files. Like there's just redacted, and it's just the content that's safe for work, which brings up what kind of workplaces people are in. But, and it's like a podcast clip or this or that. And if you go to click on the X-rated stuff, which obviously I was there to do, it will say we're not you have to register. You have to click through with your Google email or whatever. And if you're trying to register, we're not taking new registrations in Australia. So anyway, I think this is not about slagging off sex workers or making that work more difficult than it already is, but it is about saying like we needed to have something online that reflected what we believe in the real world, apparent real world, that this content should not be seen by under 18-year-olds, and that is happening from tomorrow. So anyway, you don't need to segue. Just saying you can do whatever you like.
The Jess Hill ambassador for Pornhub kind of vibe that we're getting.
Checks in the mail. Yeah.
I do very much want to move us into solutions, and thanks, Jess, for getting us there. Zac, I've heard you say in a few occasions that you want us to sit in hope and not in despair. So let's try and do that after perhaps not setting up hope in the best way earlier. What are the interventions that we're seeing that work?
Yeah, there is a lot of hope, really. And I think that I'm sure that every parent here has flashes of hope every day. I don't think that we give it enough time and attention in the same way that the fundamentals of psychology when dealing with a problematic childhood behavior is to make sure that you give the good stuff way more attention. We don't tend to do that. It's like, oh, they're not listening. We're going to really hammer this home, rather than that kindness, that compassion, that really loving connection that they have with another mate that you can really amp up. We don't seem to be attuned to those because we are terrified, because the alarmism is ridden throughout all of our feeds, throughout all of our media, that the boys are just not all right. And what I think we need to do is completely turn this on its head and go seeking thriving and flourishing. We need to find a way to amplify good behaviour in all corners, to make sure that the Epsteins and the Weinsteins and all the Steins are not on the front pages of newspapers. Like, where is, this beautiful generative, active fathering? It's on page 14 in a tiny column. It's everywhere. There are beautiful male role models all over the shop who do not get the time of day. And I think when it comes to young men, and boys especially, what we should be doing is, especially during that adolescence time, right now I get to spend a lot of time with my very young boy, and the way in which society goes is that as he ages and he moves to 12, 13, 14, I'm going to pull back because he's becoming more independent and he can go and do stuff. That is the time that I should be way more present. I should actually get pat leave then to go and spend time when he's 12 to 14 trying to work out who the fuck he is, what matters, how does he move through the world. So the idea of punitive, risk-based parenting, which is what happens with boys, which is, I am going to try and find a way for him not to be that. That's how so many, especially feminist women, come up to me. They're terrified about having boys because they don't want to raise a rapist. That's not a good way to start, yeah? Let's try and find a way to understand what you are aspiring towards. What is that thing that you want him to be? And how can you firstly foster it in your own relationship with your partner? If you're in a heterosexual relationship, how are you going to have those conversations? How can the father kind of show up? I've been thinking a lot about the idea of, how we can have these conversations where, and I was speaking with my wife this morning, where I can ask for her ideas about something. I can ask for her understanding of something, or how am I supposed to go about this, and showing equality in a day-to-day way that I'm not just the problem solver and she's the this. And trying to actually do the modeling, and this is what's really important, men especially do not do visible modeling. They do this posturing, but they don't do visible modeling. When I think about what type of father I want to be, what type of man I want to be, it's about visibility. And visibility means all aspects of myself. What we tend to do is that this morning I was sitting with him and I'm looking at him, and I would never think to do this, but I'm like, I need to prepare for this thing. And I go, I'm going to tell him that I'm fucking nervous. Because I would never do that, and my dad would never have done that with me. He would have sat there, he would have kind of been a mess. If he'd had a really tough day, he would never tell me what happened. He'd just be a bit shitty. And I think it's really important to humanize yourselves with boys, and that is what teachers should be doing. It's pulling them into adulthood for an understanding of, I, as an adult man, have not worked this out. And I will continue to sit alongside you in the mud and work it out with you. Too many footy players are saying, I had anxiety, I had depression. Ta-da, I fixed it. Like, we continue to work day by day to understand ourselves, and our boys should understand that we are in a very similar situation to them.
And that's showing that humility and repair. And again, you know, shout out to my partner David. He does this so well with our little girl. You know, he really shows that humility. Like, I was wrong to do that. I'm really sorry. You know, and explains why it was. Sometimes we're sometimes we're not always age appropriate. We're just sort of like, so, you know, adult and therapy. But anyway, but it is sort of, you know, having those open conversations that Zac's talking about, and you can see it. And now she'll say things like, you know, she'll have been a shit, and she'll say things like, I'm really sorry, Mummy. I did not behave properly then, and I really just want to apologise. I'm like, oh my God, it works. She's 8, so I'll see how that works when she's 14. Yeah, she's that's all right. It's a true red pill. But one of the organisations that I always just give big ups to in this regard is She Is Not Your Rehab.
100%.
And the title of that organisation tells you everything you need to know. And that's really what they're trying to promote. Is it's like, don't go to her for every single thing. Don't outsource all of your emotional intelligence and everything to her and expect her to be everything for you. You need to do that work yourself. And I think that thing about fathers, I mean, a lot of fathers are finding their way in ways that they didn't see modelled from their fathers. And I mean, still, we have 4 in 10 kids growing up in domestic violence in Australia. So, like, we haven't sorted the father issue out. But this new generation of fathers are qualitatively different from the one before. And what She Is Not Your Rehab does is they actually have an app for guys called Inner Boy. And it really is like a 30-day guided program. And it's led by Matt Brown, who grew up in just, you know, such intense violence in New Zealand, such that, I mean, he shorthands it by saying when he and his siblings watched Once Were Warriors, they thought it was a comedy. You know, and so he leads this 30-day guided program, and it's really about trying to get in between those moments where you would just have this reaction or this agitation, and that you would take it out on your kid, or you wouldn't like take a moment to see where they're coming from. And just very briefly, I tell a story, it's so beautiful, about this guy, Ty, who went through this program. And I tell a story basically of one morning in a house, and Ty's in the kitchen, he's gotten up early, and he sees the dishes in the sink from the night before, and he's immediately enraged because he told his son to do those dishes. Now, he's like, internally, he's like in chaos, because when he was a kid, if that had happened, he would have been taken out the back and belted, basically. His wife comes into the kitchen. The first thing he wants to go and say is like, oh, he hasn't done this, and why didn't you make him do this, and create this scene? And instead, apparently, because he's done this app and he's had some, you know, breathing exercises, he's takes that moment, takes a beat, and just asks, what happened last night? Why didn't he do it? And she says, well, actually, he had a really awful day yesterday. He was bullied. He came home really upset. And so Ty has a moment where he's like got a choice. Do I say, well, that's too bad, and I go and discipline him anyway? Or do I go into his bedroom and ask him if he's okay and use it as a moment to connect? And he takes the second road, and he goes in and asks his son if he's okay. His son talks to him about it. And instead of there being a massive conflagration in the kitchen that morning, he's connected with his son, and then he throws him the dish towel and says, let's do these dishes together. And it's like, oh my God, we just broke a cycle of violence, or at least part of it. But that's the work that needs to be done. It's complex and it's slow and it's painful, and it requires us to reparent ourselves, because a lot of us didn't see that, even from parents who did their best, but maybe weren't really equipped to be present and attached and connected to us. That's what we have to bring our kids.
Yep.
Zac, I'm going to amalgamate a bunch of the questions that are coming through here, and thank you for your questions, everyone. I'm trying to capture more than one at once, so if it doesn't sound like I'm reading yours directly, it's not that I haven't read it. There are a whole bunch here that are basically like, that sounds great. I'm trying really hard to be present, to be empathetic, to talk to my son. He doesn't talk back. So what do I do?
Look me up. Give me a call. I'm the boy whisperer. Grunts go a long way, guys. Don't underestimate. I think what's really important, lots of people obviously talk about the power of shoulder-to-shoulder activity. What I have done a lot therapeutically is playing ping pong, playing Fortnite, playing pool, doing things with their hands. Like that idea of like biological differences, I don't buy into until you get into the notion that they've been socialized into play in a certain way where freedom and relaxation allow their brain to go into a reptilian place where they are actually, willing and able to express what's happening. Most importantly, do not expect vulnerability to look the same in your son and your daughter, for instance. In the same way that when I do couples counseling and the wife sits down and says, he just doesn't say anything. And I say to him, what happens when you come home? And he says, I just tell her I've had a shit day. And then she talks for 30 minutes about her day because she thinks that I'm done. So shit is a very short word, but means a lot. And if we allow space there, firstly, he might follow it up with something. And secondly, it doesn't need to happen or look or feel or sound like you think that it should. So if you're in the car, they always talk about this, and you're looking in the rearview mirror, if you're not looking at him face to face, therapeutically, I do not look my clients in the eye. Lots of my friends have been like, why are you always looking in the corner of the room? I'm like, oh, it's learned, I'm sorry. But it's allowing that space for him to do this on his own terms. Don't impart these constricting rules of what you think emotion should look like. Let him teach you about, at the start, what he is safe and able to describe, and start to crack open that door with questions that actually matter to him, not questions that you think are important. So this idea that he's had a bad day and he doesn't want to talk about it, go and do something fun with him, even if he doesn't, if that's not the first thing that he wants to do, because the connective tissue is what allows him to feel safe, and then it allows him to choose the language that he wants, and then you model what happened with you today. What was going on in your day? Don't you be monosyllabic as well. I'm sure that if you think about how you're talking to your kids, you don't want to, overburden them with your stresses, but there's ways in which you can discuss the internal chaos that we all have, as I said, in a way to them that's going to make them feel like they're a part of that conversation. So grunts are fair. Shoulder-to-shoulder activity is important. Going to footy and sitting next to your son. I used to do that with my dad, and when it's, a 3-hour cricket, 5-hour test cricket game, the stuff you end up talking about, it's pretty wild. So give it time and space and really allow him to dictate where it goes. And the empathy and compassion go some way, but sometimes he kind of wants to just tough it out. He just wants to get into this conversation and kind of wants to be angry about something and be short about it, because that's what's safe for him. And so just allow him little junctures of that, and then they add up. And I'm sure that if you witnessed it from a video playback, you'd actually go, that was okay.
Jess, I think digital and media literacy are sort of one of those things that tends to come up in these kinds of conversations that we need to teach kids generally, but in this case, boys, to be able to better understand what's being served to them online, being served to them through their phone, and what it's trying to do to them, understand the point of view of what's coming at them. But there's big gap between civics class and, you know, it's 11 p.m. and you're sitting in your bed with your phone, right? You're not necessarily going to be thinking critically in that moment. So how do we build that critical thinking muscle, and how do we make sure that we've got a broader understanding of this stuff before people are starting to ingest it?
Yeah, well, I guess that's like, these are the kind of non-negotiable conversations we're needing to have with our younger kids now, right? Like, I think if you've got older teenagers, it's said like the access points are sometimes a little bit more limited, but it's never too late to talk about it. And just I think the important thing, I guess, is because the manosphere is selling itself as the new punk, and it's like, this is a way for you to rebel against the mainstream. I do think that literacy is important to say, like, this is not about rebellion. Like, they're actually exploiting you, you know, like, and actually rebellion would look like rejecting that. No, it's not like the opening salvo that I would suggest using, especially if your boys are sort of like finding a sense of solidarity or allyship with some of these personalities. The first, you know, the way you would come in on it is much more gentle and sort of finding out, like, what is it that appeals to you about this? Those sorts of more curiosity questions like Zac's been talking about. But I think also just to be, you know, just to be saying from quite early on, here's how the algorithm works. It works by finding out what you're outraged or angered by, and if you spend a few seconds looking at that, it will feed you more of it. You know, it's not random. It's actually quite specific about what it wants to get you to be looking at in terms of outrage content. You know, I think about, I'm not indoctrinating my 8-year-old, I promise, but like, we talk to her about, you know, fast food, like what fast food is trying to do. And now she sees like a McDonald's cup and she's like, I hate McDonald's. Oh, all they're trying to do is make kids fat. And I'm like, I never actually said that.
Sure.
Like, I didn't, but we did say like, hey, you know, we explained advertising and marketing, and she like picked it up like that. And now she's like a little communist. Like, and it's just like way more, you know, against all that stuff than I. It's like she sees a McDonald's out on a truck and she goes into a spiral of depression about the world. And I'm like, mate, no, it's okay. It's all right. It's not that bad. But so I think sometimes just like empowering them with that information to be like, here's how it works. So you're just not like, you're not going to end up being a sucker. And then you can make your own choices. Like, I'm like, if you want to go to a McDonald's party and eat chicken McNuggets till your eyes fall out, I have no problem with that. But you obviously do. So that's, I think, we can't rely on schools. I think schools will probably eventually, or in the not too distant future, incorporate digital literacy into their education, probably a little late. Finland and other countries have been doing this for years. But we can't rely on schools. Schools can't rely on parents. But the parents in this room, I think talking about that stuff's really important.
I think if we're undermining the model, the manosphere model especially, which is so mainstreamed, and I think we need to be very careful about what we mean when we talk about it, because, you know, whenever I do like dating show podcasts and they're like, what are all the red flags? And I'm like, if Joe Rogan is a red flag, you're never going to meet a guy, because 140 million people are listening to his podcast. We need to be very clear around the bounds of this thing and being willing to engage in conversations such that, yes, you know, when we talk about the algorithm, men are from Mars and women are from Venus. They are on different planets.
Yeah, they are living on different planets.
And they cannot speak to each other. And so we need to get to the point where, you know, sexual, physical, domestic violence aside, which is extremely important, there's also just a vein of understanding that uncomfortable conversation between the sexes is necessary for progress. If they are viewing the world in very different ways and we are not willing to thread that, if we go, hey, we're going to sit down with our boys and tell them the manosphere is bullshit, it's ripping you off, it's taking all of this from you, we then create a bit more of a vacuum because we don't really have anything to fill it with. So, as I've always said, if there are any content creators here, you know what we do at Movember, we're trying to create more and more, you know, positive manhood influencers who are actually using, this is the thing, everyone goes, Tate, nah, not doing anything, disgusting. they've mastered this thing.
We
should be learning from it and finding ways to go, how can we offer a very clear-eyed, and I think I said this in an article last week that I thought was going to get me in hot water, but I'm still safe, so hopefully I'll remain so. When a boy comes in to see me, is a 12-year-old, and at some point I ask him about his mum or his sister, and he says a misogynistic joke to me. This is session 1. If I police him, if I shut him down, I will never see him again. That is consistently the case. Now, by session 4, if I have built up respect with him, I can do a callback. And I can talk about what happened there, and I can build a bridge for him to understand what that does and how that harm works, because he wanted connection with me, and he thought connection was going to come through misogyny, through locker room talk. And so I don't laugh at it, but I'm trying to find a way not to discipline him in the way that he's used to, so that he disengages. Really, what we are witnessing with young boys is D words: detachment, disengagement, disillusionment, whatever it might be. They are detaching and disconnected from the world and their reality, and they are going and creating these niche subcultures which are just creating lots of harm. What we need to do is reconnect. We need to find a way to bring them back in to these spaces and places and show them that they're actually allowed to show some of this murkiness and messiness. There's obviously a line, but we need to not be overly policing, because as I said at the start, masculinity is a culture of policing to start with. So they're so attuned to that and so afraid of it, you will just lose them. And the goal here is progress, is connection, is talking about these issues with them. And if they're not there, we're not making any progress.
And then on the other side, just as we wind down, is that we have to, it is doing both our boys, our girls, our non-binary people a favour if we raise everyone to be accountable, right? So accountability is about repair, but for people who have done the harm, it shows them, it actually builds a sense of integrity over time. If they can repair and there can be some sense of reconciliation or some sense of justice, even that doesn't mean that the person they've harmed needs to forgive them or needs to say, hey, it's okay, thanks for apologising. But at least it's made visible in a way that there is some safety built around it, such that they don't end up, 20 years later in Zac rooms or in, David's psychotherapy room, feeling so much closeted shame that they can't even reach anymore because of the original harm that they committed, that was never made visible, that was never accounted for, and that has now been part of setting the trajectory of their life. And I think the more that we, this thing around that term empathy that became very well known a few years ago from Kate Mann, a philosopher, Australian philosopher, the disproportionate amount of sympathy given to men and boys who do harm to others, like boys will be boys, well, he didn't know what he was doing, he comes from a hard background, all the rest of it. That does not do boys any favours. It does not do the people that they have harmed any favours, obviously. The more that we can build that accountability into our parenting, into our communities, into our peer groups, the better for everyone. I think that our rush to excuse boys because we're worried about how fragile actually they are and how shame sensitive they are is not doing them any favours.
The past is not their fault, but the present is their responsibility. And I continue to, and responsibility and service and altruism and being something for someone else is a core tenet of healthy manhood, and we need to sell that. We need to sell that to them.
And accountability is about high expectations, right? If you're not holding someone accountable, your expectations of them are low.
Yeah.
And we want to tell boys our expectations are high. I know how good you are. I know what you're capable of, and it's not this.
Let's get there. Yep.
Folks, what I've really valued about this conversation is that I think we have carefully refused two very easy exits. One is the exit of despair, that this is all too big, too scary, the tech companies own the boys, we're screwed. We got close, but we didn't quite go down there. And we also avoided the exit of false hope, which is the kind of, do these three things and your son's fine. I think the truth is much harder than that, much more complicated, and it's also much more interesting and deserving of conversations like these. Kids are complicated, and the structures that are around those kids are sometimes even more complicated. But I think the fact that this room is full at 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning tells me something about the problems that we decide we're willing to show up for, to try and solve. And I want to thank Jess and I want to thank Zac for helping guide us through so expertly. Thank you both. Thank you all so much for being here. Enjoy the rest of the festival and have a good ride home in the car with your boys, sitting next to each other, not looking at each other, having a good chat. Thanks, everyone.